Hey there folks, and welcome back to my channel. For today, I want to sit down and get a little personal with y'all and talk about the only body modification I have that I regret. And I've debated for an incredibly long time talking about this experience openly online, and I could waste like an entire video explaining what has held me back from doing so up until now and what has made me finally decide to, but that's neither here nor there. Today I want to talk about genuinely the only body modification I have ever gotten done that I have any regrets about. And it is not a piercing and not a tattoo and not an implant. It is one of my pieces of scarification. And I want to preface this video by saying that I love most of the scarification that I have, and it's amazing and it's wonderful, and I have zero regrets about it, and in fact am hoping to get more scarification in the future. But this is more of a lesson on really researching people and being careful who you trust, and just kind of a bit of a sad story with some trigger warnings for sexual abuse and abuse in general. I decided not to script this video because I really wanted it to be honest, and now I am sitting here wondering if maybe I should have scripted it because this is harder to talk about than I realized. Well, you know what, let's just dive right in. If we rewind time back to little, like I would say about 20-year-old Lynn, I was on a break from being in the industry. I had left my first like really bad apprenticeship and was working to get back into the industry in what would become my like second good apprenticeship. And at the time, I was just really looking to network and make connections and meet anyone who could lead to me potentially getting an apprenticeship again in the industry. I was motivated, I was passionate, I really cared about this, I really wanted to be a piercer, and so part of what I was doing was seeing a lot of guest piercers whenever they were in town in the tri-state area. I was living in Philadelphia at the time, which was great because Infinite and Noka Oi were always having guest piercers, and New York and New Jersey were really close, so there were no shortage of people for me to go to meet and network with and just kind of put my face out there and be like, hi, I'm Lynn, I really, really want to be a piercing apprentice, I really care about this industry. It's nice to meet you, keep me in mind if, anywhere you go or anyone you know is looking for an apprentice. And as a part of this, a piercer at the time named Richard Ivy, who was incredibly well known online and who was a body piercer who also did scarification, was coming to do some guest work in Philly. And I came to meet with him at that studio and inquire about getting some of my first pieces of scarification done. And I went in and I met with him, and my original plan was just to get one piece on a transgender symbol as scarification on the outside of my thigh. Oh, by the way, I love that scar. I'll throw a picture of it up on the screen. It healed phenomenally. It's one of my favorite pieces of scarification I have. People mistake it for a white ink tattoo quite literally all the time, but it's just a very well healed, very happy scar, and I love it and I love everything that it represents. But while I was there, I mentioned some other scarification projects that I wanted to do in the future, including the Tyrell logo from Blade Runner, which was my favorite movie. And Richard was immediately like, oh my god, I would love to do that for you. I would give you a discount if you wanted to get both in one sitting. I think that's such a cool design. I don't get to do like interesting geometric stuff like this. I usually am doing like just simple symbols or flowers. So he was really excited about my designs, which made me feel good. And I was pretty hesitant to get two large pieces of scarification done at once because I'd never gotten any scarification previously, but the promise of a deal and his encouragement and excitement sold me, so I decided to get both done, and a week or so passed and I showed up for my appointment. And I went in, everything seemed good and normal. We stenciled the transgender logo on the outside of my thigh where I wanted it first. That cutting took about 3, almost 4 hours, and it was pretty intense. It was pretty intense, not gonna lie. I was definitely like fully not in a completely there headspace after having just sat for that. So time came and we started stenciling on the Tyrell logo, which I originally wanted on the inside lower down on my other thigh. And I have a tattoo there now, but at the time I did not, and I wanted to put that scar there. And I told him the other tattoos that I was planning for this leg. And he said, well, they're not going to fit with this scar here. Why don't we move it up higher? And I was resistant to the idea at first because I didn't want the scar higher. Like, you weren't going to be able to see it. It was going to be too hidden. But eventually he convinced me to move it higher and then move it higher again till it was basically at the apex of my thigh. And I had just gotten like a 3-hour-long scarification before this, so my mental processing was not there. And so he stenciled it up much higher than where I wanted it, and I was very much unsure, but just kind of went along with what he was suggesting because I trusted him. I trusted that, you know, he was a well-known and well-regarded piercer and artist, and all the piercers that I liked seemed to look up to him and like him, so obviously it's probably fine. I didn't end up mentioning any concerns that I had in the moment, which looking back on was partially on me, but also understanding that I had just gone through a really long scarification. Of course my brain wasn't all there. And no mention was made to me of the reality of having a large scar done in this placement. We did the cutting, and that second cutting was rough. It was very rough. He accidentally went too deep in a couple different areas. With the understanding that I have now, the upper inner thigh is a very hard place to do a good scarification. That is not easy skin to work with, and I've always had stretch marks on my inner thighs, so that did not make anything any easier. But that stretch mark and that difficult skin should have been one of the first giveaways, because like many of us, I do not have a thigh gap. My thighs touch when I walk, touch when I sit. It's just how my body is built. I got those thick thighs. And at no point did Richard as an artist mention, like, hey, your thighs clearly rub and sit together here, and we are putting a large scarification on one of them. This may have complications in the future. No, and during the cutting, there were definitely times where he was touching my body in a way that he did not need to be in that area. And at the time, I was in too much pain, and there were too many adrenaline and endorphins going on in my brain to realize that. And I also just trusted him because I trusted other people in the industry who trusted him. So we finished the scarification, and my boyfriend at the time came and picked me up, and I went home, and Richard knew all this. And a few days later, I saw him around at an event in Philly, and he tried to convince me to go out on a date with him. And he knew I had a boyfriend, and when I respectfully declined, he got pretty rude and pretty threatening to me. I struggled through healing that inner thigh scar. The outer thigh scar healed great. Phenomenal. Amazing. The inner thigh one, however, gave me non-stop issues. I got a brutal heat rash during the healing process, very irritated skin, and the scar was just not healing well like it should have. If I have some photos of what it looked like as it was healing, I'll throw them up here. I reached out to Richard multiple times during the healing process about some of the complaints and the problems I was having, and he just kind of brushed them off as just normal problems with scarification. And then at a certain point he told me that I just probably wasn't taking care of things correctly. I had at this point done absolutely everything to the letter of the care that I was given. Over time that scar did heal, but with where it is placed on truly the apex of my thigh, I'll show you a picture of it now healed. It's certainly not the prettiest scar. I have constant problems with it chafing when I walk, especially during the summer months. I have to wear protective clothing and topical treatments on the area. And it still, even with all of that, sometimes becomes excruciatingly painful after a day of walking around. I deal with regular reoccurring cysts that form inside the scar that I believe are from friction, from walking and movement and rubbing in the area. And it sucks. At this point in my life, I don't even really care how the scar looks. I don't really care about the texture or the color or the coloration of it. I would just love it to not be painful all of the time and not inhibit my ability to walk and move and do certain things with my body. But it does. And, almost 10 years since I originally got it, and as a much more knowledgeable and experienced piercer and professional in the industry, I immediately realize what a terrible idea for placement the upper inner thigh would be for a scar, and logically how many problems that would cause with rubbing and chafing and movement and walking. And think back to the fact that as a client, I was never given a warning that could happen. It was never even discussed. It was never mentioned during any of the aftercare, and it was never mentioned when I had problems as it healed. And now I am an adult with this scar on my leg permanently, and I've spoken to dermatologists about it, and I've spoken to other heavy modification artists about it, and the gist of it is there's really nothing I can do. I just have to try and keep the tissue as healthy as I can and do what I can to minimize chafing and rubbing, but it's probably still going to happen. So I am now saddled with a modification that very regularly causes me pain and discomfort and is unsightly. And that is very hard to admit, and I think a lot of us don't want to paint the industry negatively and don't want our stories to be misused as horror stories, especially because I do have so many other pieces of scarification that I loved, that heal great, that are fine. This particular piece turned out the way it did because it turns out that Richard Ivey was an abuser, and he ended up outed from the community and even arrested and taken to court for abuse and violence in the years that followed. And this was a predatory person who saw me as an easy target, and I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt shows a placement that allowed him to be inappropriate with me without any consideration for what placing this scar here would do to me for the rest of my life. And I now have to deal with the lifetime consequences of this. And I've come to terms with it. I figured out a system. I figured out things that work to minimize the problems, to minimize the issues. I've gotten it relatively under control at this point. It's been, again, almost a decade of living with it. But when you are getting work done like this, be it a piercing, a tattoo, and especially modification work, you are really entrusting your body to the person who is doing that work for you. And entrusting them to have good intentions with your body, but also entrusting them to have knowledge and education and take care with your body. And we talk about it all the time, we're only humans. Piercers make mistakes, tattoo artists make mistakes, heavy mod artists makes mistakes. That's kind of a risk that you take in doing any of this. I mean, doctors and surgeons make mistakes too. But this is why it is so important to do your research about who you see. And with heavy modification work, it becomes doubly so. Because if you haven't already seen my video on heavy mods, A, go watch it. But B, it still is illegal surgery in most places, and there's not good regulations. There's not websites to go on and see easily accessible reviews and information, and it is very hard to know who is a safe practitioner who you can trust with your body and who isn't. And I really thought at the time I did my due diligence. I saw someone who was supported by a lot of members of the community, who had a broad online portfolio, and who traveled to a lot of really great studios and places. And I will live with the consequences of trusting that person and making that decision for literally the rest of my life. and there is really nothing that other mud artists or medical professionals can do to change this. So I share this for you now as a cautionary tale, as a reminder to be really careful who you entrust your body with, and a reminder that even for the most educated and most well-meaning among us, there is still a very real risk when we choose to get these modifications and do these things with our bodies. And as much as I don't want my story to be used as a way to vilify or demonize the industry, I also think it's time for people to start speaking up realistically about some of the experiences they have with some of these practitioners and some of these modifications, and talking honestly with other folks who may be considering getting that work done about what can and does go wrong. I think there's a place in our community for success stories, but there is equally a place for stories of failure. Despite the fact that I've had hundreds of piercings over my lifetime and tattoos and heavy modifications, even some that have not worked out, I've had plenty of piercings fail and reject and not heal. I have no regrets about any of those. I have tattoos that I ended up not liking and getting covered up, and I have no regrets about any of those either. Truly, the only regret I have when it comes to the work that I've done for my body is this one scar, and I don't regret having gotten it, but I do regret having trusted the wrong person for it and having been in a situation where I was very vulnerable and very impressionable. So please, to everyone out there watching this video, do your research, be really careful about who you see for this kind of stuff, and please try and stay safe.